Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Fistful of Dice. My name is Matt, and I am joined today by my absolute tabletop colleague, Tim from Tabletop Terrors. Tim, say hey.
Hey.
And we're just going to kind of hang out for 45-ish minutes and just sort of talk about something that we are working on sort of behind the scenes of our own volition. Something we call Gloam, which is sort of a new campaign setting. And we're not sure exactly how this campaign setting is going to manifest. You might see it in an adventure kit. You might see it in games we run. But it's something that we're excited about and something we want to talk about. So, yeah, so I guess from a high level, what do we want to start with here, Tim?
I like creation stories. And so for me, I think it's kind of cool to talk about how we were both working on different things that had sort of corners that were touching. And so I think it was the day I was moving and you had mentioned like, hey, I'm kind of coming up with some stuff in this vein, kind of coming up with some stuff in this vein. And then we were like, hey, why don't we merge the two? And that's kind of where we started to say, well, what pieces from your ideas and what pieces from my ideas do we want to kind of merge together? So I kind of like that idea that this is the first formal, actual collaborative world that we're building, not a world that one of us had already been working on and brought to the table for advice.
Right, yeah. And that is kind of a cool thing. And it sort of, like you said, it sort of started out that way because you and I were both independently working on things that had a lot of points that could sort of be connected to make something really, really cool. And so to speak on that point, there was something you were working on that you were calling Thy Fearful Symmetry. And there was something I was working on that I was sort of, the working title for it was the Flintlock Dominion. And I think the reason why we decided to kind of like mingle those things is we both were like, this is sort of Victorian colonial era tech with Cthulhu in it. And we were both working on that sort of independently of each other. So it just kind of made sense to sort of match those things up.
Dude, exactly. And I was excited because your ideas covered a bunch of ground that I had no concepts for. So when we merged them together, I don't think a lot was removed. It was kind of like these interlocked fairly well. And then, some of the fun parts started of like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, and that was really fun. So.
Yeah. Well, and your sort of, your concept was sort of this world where, humans are sort of, they're in this city called, I think it was Oubliette was what you were calling it. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, cool. But we sort of had this idea of, or you had this idea of like sort of these points of light cities where humans are sort of, oh. You there? Nope.
Yeah.
You're there. Okay, awesome. For a second, your little logo came up and it went quiet, and I was like, oh no.
No, I'm still here.
So you had this idea of kind of these points of light cities, and it's sort of like wilderness outside of it and all these weird things sort of happening. And I sort of had this idea of a world where humans were in charge, but they were in charge because they had used technology to rid the world of elves and dwarves and other sort of, subhuman creatures. And those two ideas sort of meshed so well where it's like, well, what if it's a world where humans using technology like Flintlock Firearms had gained the upper hand in this sort of struggle, had rid the world of, almost driven the elves and the dwarves to extinction. But in doing so, they had also sort of negated this old magic that was tied to the elves and the dwarves and these other elder races. And that this old magic was the only thing sort of keeping this eldritch darkness at bay. And so those two ideas when we kind of slammed them together, it was like one of those two great tastes that taste great together situations where it's like, hey, you got peanut butter in my jelly. You got jelly in my peanut butter. Hey, sort of thing. So.
Yeah, I really liked, you know, one of the things that I love with when you world build, really cool names you give to things that allow I would say, you don't need to know what it is, but you know what it is just in the name. Flintlock Dominion. I get what I'm getting into, and I love that the just some of the things you immediately brought to the table with, like, hey, let's call this this, let's call this this. It really, when they mashed up the peanut butter and jelly, it was like, man, this feels like it's already done and we haven't even started. And I knew right then, I was like, this is going to be a lot of fun to world build, because these pieces, like, I could hand this rough draft document to somebody and they could get it. A bunch of extrapolation, it's already there, and I love that feeling.
Yeah, it's a very focused campaign setting, and that's, you know, something that we were talking about actually when we were together in the Seattle area just a couple weeks ago, was the difference between sort of a kitchen sink setting and a very focused, sort of tightly, you know, focused campaign setting. And there's pros and cons to both of those things, right? You have like Aeronaut, which is more of a kitchen sink setting where there's a little bit of everything going on. But then you have something like Gloam, which is very tightly focused into a specific sort of tone and feeling and a certain type of game that you're wanting to run. And like some of the inspirations going into it were like Twilight Zone was a big inspiration for you, and just having weird things happen that aren't necessarily explainable, and create a setting that really works for specifically one-shot games. You know, these little contained stories happening in this weird world. And that was something that really spoke to me as well. And so, you know, having that specific tone going into the world building is cool for me. And it's similar to like a Crore, where it's like I went into Crore with a very specific, like, I want it to look and feel like this. And I feel like we're kind of doing the same thing with Gloam, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's almost, I'm not saying you can't run campaigns in Gloam. I think there would be opportunity for that.
Yeah.
To my initial idea a long time ago was exactly what you said. Twilight Zone episodes. A good Twilight Zone episode is essentially a one-shot. It's got a beginning, middle, and end. It's self-contained. That singleness of effect, that Edgar Allan Poe sort of, this all happens, and it's not necessarily intended to revisit. It's intended to cause a cool, emotional ride that is done, and you'll probably never visit it again, because visiting again sort of takes the mystique out of it.
Yeah.
And explain things takes the mystique out of it, just that cool feeling. And so to design a setting that is created to run those games without making the players feel as though you're gypping them, and understanding that the social contract is, let's make some weird one-shots here, or even quick trilogies. But I don't see this as a campaign setting for me.
Right.
So what do you feel about that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that just given this sort of like, I mean, the name itself, Gloam, right? Gloam is twilight. It's the waning of the light. And to me, the word gloam in and of itself means temporary, fleeting, dwindling, right? And that's sort of why we latched onto that name so much, is because it said so much about the campaign setting. It's dwindling light, it's darkness, it's temporary. It's the last bit of daylight before the night. And that's sort of, we're calling this near apocalyptic, which is, you know, the apocalypse hasn't happened, but everyone's pretty much aware that it's coming and it's going to happen soon. And so everyone's just kind of trying to like figure out, what are we going to do about this? Like we can't fight this darkness back. So we got to figure out what we're going to do about it. And so you have, you know, humanity sort of cowering behind the walls of their cities. And then these just foolhardy people sort of going out, whether it's, you know, just they've got nothing to lose. They want money. They want to investigate this sort of, you know, this eldritch magic that's out there. It's sort of a tailor-made thing one shots, like you're saying. And I think that the name Gloam implies that as well, as like, you know, things are fleeting, things are dwindling, and the end of all things is coming. And so we only have time for a one shot.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And I loved kind of the working title you were throwing around at one point, where it's Gloam, the Last Age.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that will stick, but it said a lot to me in that most post-apocalyptic settings, I think the ones that I've experienced or played in don't have the exact level of ingredients that we're trying to cook up here. I love the idea that if we had to make an infographic, it's sort of like a picture of Cthulhu plus a picture of a guy in a tricorn hat plus a picture of maybe a steampunkish kind of minimal steampunk thing, plus Twilight Zone logo. It's like then setting that in the post or near apocalypse, rather, not post apocalypse, but near apocalyptic era. I just really thought, I feel like all those ingredients just make this wonderful stew that I want to play games in.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, to speak to that point and to maybe give people sort of like a clearer picture of what Gloam looks like, you and I were talking last night, and I messaged you, and I was like, dude, I got this really clear mental image in my head of something, and it was a crashed dirigible, right? So this sort of blimp airship-looking thing that is crashed. You know, I imagine that the structure holding the gas in is sort of you know, hanging up like rib cage. You know, it's sort of shattered and stuff. There's maybe fire in the background, and there's this small kind of like desperate band of adventurers, and they're taking cover behind the wreckage of this dirigible, and they all have their flintlocks. They're firing out into the night. There are just unknowable horrors creeping towards them, tentacles reaching out from the darkness, like crouched, hulking shapes sort of right outside the field of light. And in the midst of all of this, there's this kind of almost construction-y looking golem creature, this sort of these mechs that we've kind of talked about, sort of in the midst of this, maybe punching one of these creatures, trying to keep them at bay. And just sort of this constant feeling that the darkness is right outside the lamplight. Like, you can carry this lamp, you can shine it around, but there's always something just right outside that lamplight, right outside your field of vision. There's something out there waiting to just kill you or worse.
I love that. Kill you or worse. So I'd love to hit on some of the things that we've kind of come up with. In addition to the flavor, some of the cool bits of lore that maybe would make Gloam different than even, say, you know, Shadow of the Demon Lord or some of these other that are kind of these near apocalyptic settings. What role do creatures like dwarves and elves play into a setting like Gloam, and what kind of balance does that strike with normal dark fantasy?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I'm most excited about, is our ideas with elves and dwarves and what we've kind of been going back from. So I can talk about elves if you maybe want to touch on dwarves and maybe some of the ideas that we had for orcs as well. I don't know if you remember that conversation that we had about that, sure. But so with the elves, what we were thinking is that so they've been driven to near extinction. And as a result, like we said, these old magics have faded and allowed the gloam, this darkness, to seep into the world. And the elves being driven to extinction, they've sort of resorted to this sort of savage, animalistic sort of survival mode, right? Where the elves are not the sort of beautiful high elves as we know them, but almost sort of the elves as they appear in sort of Norse mythology, where they're sort of like predators, right? They're sort of scary, fey creatures that live out in the wilderness and prey on people. And what we were thinking is that, what if the elves turned to the great old ones, these Lovecraftian beings that are sort of exerting their influence on the world? What if the elves turned to these great old ones and sort of gave themselves over to the great old ones in the hopes of potentially reclaiming some of their lost power, their lost lands, and trying to set things right. And so having the elves maybe go a little too far in that direction, and having, you know, Cthulhu elves, essentially savage Cthulhu fae who wield eldritch magic, and maybe, I don't know, maybe there's physical corruption that happens with them where you have elven high priests that have tentacles coming out of them and stuff. Like, I love this sort of this monstrous fae idea that we've been tinkering with, and having elves be like truly terrifying. And that's something that like Lloyd from Jarl DM is always talking about. Like, elves should be alien, they should be scary. And so we're kind of taking that and running with it. And I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, I also loved the idea that, you know, we talked about elves maybe not even being an actual playable race. The only entry you would see as an elf would be in the monster manual. You know, like, that's not something that you're supposed to be able to flip open the player's handbook and go, oh, I think I'll play an Eldritch elf. So the other thought we had, speaking to half-elves, we had talked about possibly having half-elves. That the half-elves were playable, but that the longer that you played them and the more you used magic, you actually would convert into a monster. Like, if you give into that side, you could become a full elf, and your player would basically either go mad or, you know, essentially die, but you'd no longer be a PC.
Right.
And I just loved that concept that elves were monsters. They're not playable race. You can't go, oh, let me roll up an elf, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, you know, a couple of the other things that I think we talked about, and remind me, because a lot about the dwarves and the orcs, you know, we were kind of a brainstorming session, but what I did remember about the dwarves is that, did we pretty much make it so that dwarves themselves are essentially extinct?
Yeah, we had the idea that like a lot of the dwarves had like, I love the idea of them sort of like turning to stone and like returning to the earth. And so, you know, you would find these sort of like these dwarven corpses, for lack of a better term, similar to what you guys have in Dragongrin, where there's that certain culture of dwarves that turn to stone when they die. I love that idea of like dwarven statues, you know. But then we had also talked about the idea of dwarves sort of like sort of eking out this sort of savage sort of scavenger survival, like underneath human cities, and making them almost like vermin, you know, and having them be sort of an old wives' tale where it's like, all right, you need to be back by 7 o'clock before sun goes down, or a dwarf might snatch you, you know, that sort of thing, where it's like, people don't really believe in dwarves anymore, but they are literally like living in the sewers and tunnels underneath human cities.
Yeah, I loved that. And I loved that for a one-shot, a monstrous creature. Again, you know, the players who are used to some standard D&D 5th edition stuff are playing through thinking, oh, okay, this is probably a troll. Or, oh, okay, you know, that sort of thing. And it ends up being this feral dwarf.
Yeah.
You know, who's maybe stealing kids, or, you know, whatever it is. And then, you know, I loved the idea that we kind of came up with for orcs, which was really turn it on its ear and make the orcs lech and warlike and bestial, and make it so that perhaps through these eldritch magics that maybe they have found a way to sort of tap into them like the elves did, but not to retain their own beauty, not caring about that, letting it kind of warp and twist them so they look terrible, but it elongates their life, and they actually have these cities and societies, but they're terrifying. What were your thoughts on that, and did I convey that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really like that idea of having this sort of like the elves and the orcs very connected, but having them sort of have this sort of divergence that happens at some point in their cultures. And I just really like that idea of having cultures that are intrinsically tied to the Gloam, you know, this eldritch sort of presence, and having them sort of manipulated in different ways. So I really love that.
Cool. And then there are just a couple of other small things that are flavorful, but I think can make all the difference when I'm getting into a world, when I see these small 1-degree differences that just click to fit the tone and the design style. I love it. So you mentioned earlier that big mech we talked about. You know, we've gone back and forth about the humans have this low-tech sort of steam-powered, maybe Golem type armor, and they call them ogres. So an ogre in the Gloam setting specifically refers to a unit of construction or battle, this sort of construct, this mech. And I loved the idea that even in a fantasy realm, the concept of an ogre is so fantastical and so far removed that it would be like in our modern day if we named like a fast jet, like a Phoenix. Like they've named this thing the ogre because it's just, we call it an ogre. But I love that concept of the ogre punching Eldritch tentacles while Flintlock Firearms are firing around it and this hot steam is blowing off its back.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I super dig that. And like, you know me, I'm always down for mechs. So when you mentioned that, I was like, yes, hell yeah, I'm definitely down with that. And it sort of fits with the aesthetic that we're going for as well, which is it's not steampunky. I imagine the ogres being a little bit more Magitech somehow, and we haven't quite figured out how they work or exactly what they look like. But I love the idea, you know, that we're veering away, not totally from steampunk, but just not having everything be steam powered or, you know, so outside the realm of actual technology in like colonial Victorian times. So I'm really into it, man.
Me too.
One thing that I wanted to talk about too is, you know, we mentioned that it's like colonial Victorian, which is like, those are two kind of not very different, but they're two kind of different looks, you know? And one thing that we had talked about was having, you know, this city of Oubliette, being very, very Victorian, being this large, sprawling, like the last great bastion of humanity, this big city, and having that sort of be the location for our sort of like Jack the Ripper type situations, you know, and having, you know, the top hats and the sort of Victorian style garb and stuff like that. But then having that wilderness out there and those smaller cities and villages, and the farther you get away from Oubliette, the more it becomes like a frontier, and the more it looks colonial, and you have guys on horses with wagons and tricorn hats and long coats and stuff like that. And so I think that those two things meld really well because in our own history, they were happening at the same time. So I really like that idea as well.
Yeah, and I think it's from a design aesthetic, it's clear from our real world knowledge to look at an image from the world and know where the person's from.
Yeah.
And I kind of dig that. I dig that, like you said, these things occurred in the same timeline, but in totally separate parts of the world, you know, and I'm thinking someone on a wagon with a tricorn hat comes rolling into New York City and they're going to look really far out of place, you know, or like, you know, London is probably a better example. You can say, oh, he's a frontier, you know, carpetbagger. Look at the way he's dressed, or she's dressed. And then I love the idea that the tech level does stay gritty in real world because it makes those Eldritch things much more deadly.
Yeah.
So you don't have these huge Tesla coils, you know, steam powered backpacks where you're ghost busting Cthulhu's, you know. Like, to me, the way that I want to really look at tech is it's powerful when it works.
Yeah.
But it's unreliable, it's not cheap, and I think it can be deadly for both sides. If your ogre malfunctions from the, you know, older times, like when a car crashed, it was just a twisted wreckage of flesh and steel.
Yeah.
There were no airbags. You barely have a seat in that thing. And I kind of like that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that we can kind of carry that sort of design principle throughout the setting. And I even, I wrote up some sort of rudimentary like Flintlock firearm rules. And having those Flintlock firearms do a lot of damage, like have them be fairly devastating, but requiring time to reload, where you have to make a decision. If you're in a pitched battle and you are, taking cover in the wreckage of that dirigible and there's monsters coming towards you, you have to decide, do I have time to reload my flintlock, or do I need to switch to my like hatchet here and try to go in for melee? Like, I want it to be like a very tough decision as to what you're going to do. And having the firearms be very potent, very useful, but also come at like the cost of time, and like really utilize that action economy from like a mechanics standpoint to make them sort of balance out.
I love that. And I think that's going to be one of the fun things, is translating these tonal ideas into light, simple mechanics, or just ideas in the mechanics, not over complicated things, but just dialing things in a little so that the game feels different when you do go through a combat, or when you have to explore a region. It doesn't just, and we're just pretending that it's, tricorn hats and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we're getting a few questions in the chat about like, oh, hey, like, when is this happening? When are you doing this? Is this an after Harbinger thing? And like, for now, I think it's just like, it really is just like a side thing that we're kind of tinkering with. It's nothing that we're devoting an immense amount of time or energy towards, but I imagine like the first thing that you'll see from it is games. Like it's a setting that we want to run games in. And I know that Tim and I want to run games, and and James also, like we shared some stuff with him, and he was like, dude, I'm all about this. Like, I already have a bunch of ideas. And so I think James is going to run some games as well. So that's the main thing, is that we're not even necessarily looking at this of like, oh, we want to like write a campaign book for Gloam. It's like, no, we want to like play in this world. We want to discover this world together and run some games in it. And, eventually you might see an adventure kit set in Gloam, or, I don't know, just like little supplements. We're not necessarily looking like big picture yet at all. And obviously, finishing Oath, writing Dead Man's Guide to Dragon Grin, Campaign Master 2, Harbinger, like those are our big book priorities right now.
Exactly. No matter how many books we write, you still have to have fun and be inspired and, do the cool stuff too. And really where this started is just chat messages back and forth. Hey, what if this? What if this? The intention was never to make a setting like proper.
Yeah.
It was always just like, oh, dude, wouldn't this be cool? Wouldn't this be cool? And then before we knew it, it had grown so large that it was like, hey, do you want to run some games in this?
No, exactly. Exactly.
Like, yeah, let's run some games in it. We don't have to be publishing a book, because before Absolute Tabletop, we would run games in different settings all the time, Yeah. So it's kind of cool to do this outside of AbTab, and then maybe let it grow into a product after we've had some fun in there.
Absolutely. And that's something that, we should remind people of, is that, yeah, we're RPG publishers. We write and publish books, but we're also just big fat nerds who love running D&D and love creating worlds to play D&D in. And so I think that that's first and foremost, like you were saying, like our first thing was like, I want to run a game in this, not I want to write a book about this, but I've got so many ideas for cool little Twilight Zone-y one-shots that I want to run. And so that's first and foremost what we're going to be doing with it. So
totally.
So I'm going to, we can take a couple questions if people have questions about it. There's a couple other little things that we can talk about, obviously, but let's see here if we have any questions.
One of the other, while you find a question, one of the other things I was going to mention is, again, small things that I think make the setting click for me, like, oh, that's neat. We talked about having goblins, but totally changing up the junk hoarding sort of little guys who are afraid of everything, and almost making them akin to the dwarves, where they're a myth in a way, but we call them gremlins, and they're essentially these little critters that sort of live underneath things, but also take away the sort of stupid goblin aspect and make it so that perhaps they serve the orcs and are actually taking place like tonally of like some of the gnomes and things. They're actually very smart, very sharp. But I thought it was kind of cool where that same kind of wives' tale idea where it's like, it's like, well, gremlins make that ogre run, that kind of thing, where there's still a little bit of a change there, filling multiple niches in the world.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I love that. I love just like taking stuff and just twisting it a little bit. Rob from Performance Check is here, and he says, legend lore, your first one shot in this setting, improv a game pitch, go. we actually already have an idea for our first game in this, and I think that we'll probably be putting up an interest post probably this week and try to gather a few players to delve into Gloam with us. So we'll see how that goes. But maybe we should come up with a session in Gloam, like Rob is saying. So let's see here. Why don't the people in the chat, why don't you give us some ingredients, some legend lore ingredients? And if you're not familiar with legend lore, it's basically just hit us with ingredients like the session has to include a magic sword, a vampire, and blah, blah, blah. Like just throw some ingredients at us and we'll try to come up with a session that we could run in Gloam. While we wait for that, Josh Law has a question. What is the very first thing you address when imagining a new world? Is it different every time? Yeah, I think it is different every time because I think that whenever you enter a new world, you always enter through a different sort of point, right? There's always a there's always a point of inspiration where something just grabs you and makes you want to build around that. And that's I did a live stream last week and people were like, where do you start with world building? I said, start with the thing that you think is the coolest. Start with the thing that inspires you. It might be a person, it might be a magic item, it might be a location, it might be a monster. Start with whatever you are most inspired by and build around that. Would you agree with that, Tim?
I would totally agree with that. I also have a sort of set of internal rules that I don't think I've ever put voice to, but it kind of the way my head works is, my rule of thumb is, if it can live in a world I've already created, I would rather that world gain more depth than create a whole new world with just one piece.
Yes.
So, but you don't want to get kitchen sink-itis to the wrong degree where you're like, now this is my Wild West vampires. And this is, you're like, what? So every once in a while, something will hit me. And I know I think I have a pretty good knack for seeing like what would go brand-wise or setting-wise, what fits the tone. Every once in a while, something comes along and it's like, now that has to be new. It doesn't fit anywhere the way I'm imagining it without it becoming a kitchen sink-itis kind of thing.
Yeah.
Where it feels tacked on.
Exactly.
And so that's typically for me, my first filter is, how can this cool idea fit into Dragon Grid? If it can't, then what do I make a new world? Like, that's where I say, okay, this is a new world.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with that. And it's like, we couldn't necessarily drop dirigibles and firearms into Dragon Grid just because we think it's cool. It doesn't fit with the tone of Dragon Grid or the tone of Aeronoth or whatever. And so then you say, well, I think this isn't necessarily fertilizer. This is a whole other plant that I have to put somewhere else. This is a different seed that I need to cultivate in a different, garden over here. So, but yeah. Okay, so we got some ingredients in the chat. So I'm going to pull some different ingredients here from a few different people. James gave us urban setting. So it's going to take place in either Oubliette or another city in the world of Gloam. We're going to take a plague from Josh Hulls, a plague that is turning people into scarecrow-like creatures. And then we're going to take an ingredient from Josh Bingham, which is a mysterious water creature. So, urban setting, a plague that is turning people into scarecrow-like creatures. And the third ingredient is a mysterious water creature.
Okay. So, the first thing, and this is me thinking on the fly about Oubliette, I have a weird concept for the city that there's not a proper map because it's so Twilight Zone-y and crazy. Prove it. But it changes a little every so often.
Yep.
Like new alleys, new doors, new buildings, and the crazy Twilight Zone, no one cares or admits it or notices. Like something like that. So we'll have to workshop that, but I love the idea that Oubliette, if this was a campaign setting guide, would not have a map, but it would have a series of generators for what it looks like that month or something.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that a lot.
So I say it does take place in Oubliette, and that would be the urban setting. Is let's make it. I love that pulpy sort of cadaver Frankenstein-y like situation where people are just discovering human anatomy. It's still very much a magic rather than a science.
Exactly.
So let's do it in an area that's maybe like a butcher's market / cadaver sort of pilfering area, or maybe a medical school that's, just slapdash, something like that. Let's do it in that district.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, cool. So it's in sort of the that area of Oubliette. There's a plague happening where people are turning into these scarecrow-like creatures. So I think that, the session probably opens, or early on in the session, the player characters would encounter one of these scarecrow-like creatures. And I imagine that that the creatures themselves are fairly easy to put down, but they're pretty terrifying looking because, imagine scarecrows. Scarecrows are kind of creepy. Imagine a person, if the person was turned into a scarecrow. I imagine that they've sort of been drained of their fluids. They're very like husky looking, not husky like me, but husky like they're a husk. And I imagine, that their eyes are hollow. Maybe their eyes have been pulled from their sockets, to the point where if you just saw one not moving, you might assume it was like a fake sort of person stuffed with straw. So you have these creatures. The player characters maybe encounter one of these creatures. Maybe they put it down. They have a combat or something like that, or they see, someone getting attacked by one. But I like the idea that maybe, putting this water creature into it. What if this water creature is, it's coming up from the sewers, or maybe there's canals in Oubliette. It's coming up from these canals. And what if it's like draining these people of their fluid and their essence? And maybe it's getting bigger and scarier every time it does that.
I love that. And we're on the exact same page. I think it starts with a bite.
Yeah.
So it's very, Bram Stoker's like Dracula, where it's not, this thing kills you. It's, this thing bites you, drains, and then maybe leaves, or perhaps even sends, because this would, thinking about like smaller combats and how you could stage it, it'd be cool if different pieces of this thing maybe even broke off the larger it got.
Oh yeah.
So that, so they have these minions. But I love the idea that they are looking like scarecrows, but it is an actual medical condition. We could even call it something like dust bone or something, where this thing drains not just your moisture, but some sort of essence in your body, so that your skin becomes like canvas. Your eyes become sunken. And then it at some point, dust does begin to come out. Like if you get cut, dust actually comes out. So you effectively are like a scarecrow. And that's why everyone says, oh, people are turning into scarecrows. Because one of my favorite things about that time period and that era is that there is no encyclopedia to look up. There's no Google. You have to just base it off of 5 hysterical eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
And newspapers trump it up. And so these things are very real because that's just word of mouth.
Yeah, I love that. And there's the constable who's taking notes, and the people are like, I tell you, it was a scarecrow. And he's like, just like writing it down like, sure, it's a scarecrow. And he's like, take him away. And they throw him in the back of that insane asylum horse cart, and they take him off.
Exactly.
So yeah, that would be a really cool session. I could see combat, investigation, very Call of Cthulhu, where you think that the problem is, okay, we got to figure out what's going on with this sickness, this plague that is afflicting these people, turning them into these scarecrow-esque monsters. But in reality, there's just some terrible aquatic creature, some, deep one sort of thing coming up out of the canals or the sewers and biting these people and giving them this sickness. And you're going to have to contend with that giant monster at some point. Cool. So that was a...
I love that. And I love a red herring where the quack professor at the Slapdash Medical School is essentially, he's come up with some new elixir or new medicine or new salve or serum, and he is the first suspect because everyone thinks that this is this guy's serum that's killing everyone. But then I would even flip it around and make it so that maybe the serum itself repelled the aquatic creature if used properly, or if, something. I would kind of tie that in, but I'd give that nutty professor would be my red herring so that everyone thought it was him. Probably first stop adventure there.
I love that. Red herrings are essential in any sort of like mystery investigation. They're essential in episodes of The Twilight Zone. They're essential in Call of Cthulhu. And so having that be a part of it is great. So Awesome. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to kind of wrap it up here. Really, we were feeling inspired by it, and we want to run some games soon. So we wanted to put something out there to just tell people, hey, here's something cool we're working on. You'll probably see some games from it soon, and maybe eventually some books or something. So yeah, that's Gloam. I hope you guys are intrigued at least, and there'll be more to come, I'm sure, on both this channel and also Tabletop Terrors. So Tim, thanks for joining me, man. Go ahead and give a sign off here.
Sure. I was just going to say that, hopefully if I'm not robot voicing in my car here, the more world building and ideas is Tabletop Terrors. That's the channel I run with James, and we love doing that kind of stuff. So if you haven't already, head over to Tabletop Terrors, give us a sub, and you'll see more of us there.
Absolutely, yeah. I love your guys' world building videos where you just sit and talk and come up with stuff for your World of Dragongrin, and it's awesome, man. All right, so Tim, thank you, man, and thank everyone for turning out at kind of this weird time of the day that we found to talk about Gloam, and I'm sure there'll be more to come. So take care, everyone, and happy gaming all.